I'm Brian Hiatt. This is Rolling Stone Music Now. On Cowboy Carter, Beyoncé mixes country, R&B, and some hard-hitting guitars, among many other elements. And as the artist herself is well aware, there used to be a name for that kind of American melange, rock and roll. So there's an argument that Cowboy Carter, which she's made clear is a Beyoncé album, rather than the full-on country effort many expected, is as much of a rock album as anything else. But Cowboy Carter is many things at once. With 27 often wildly disparate tracks, it isn't an easy work to pin down. In a minute, Rolling Stone's Larisha Paul is going to join me to go through a ton of those tracks and really dig deep on the album, and also share her theories on why Beyoncé's next album, the third in the trilogy that started with Renaissance, will be Beyoncé's real rock album. But first, let's hear briefly from my interview with one of the album's many guest stars, country singer and former X Factor contestant Willie Jones, who weighs in on the thrill of singing with Beyoncé on the ballad Just for Fun.
I always crying, time moves quickly and so do I. So I'll say my goodbye.
Beyonce is from Louisiana and Texas. So like their rap, their soul, their country is in her blood. It runs deep in her roots. She's opening the door for so many in the genre and just in music. That's what she's always done. So like having the biggest, bestest, most busiest artist in the industry recognize not only myself, but Shabuzi and Linda Martell and Stoney Edwards. I'm on the same album with Miley Cyrus, Dolly Parton, Willie Nelson, Rumi Carter. It's just really cool to be able to usher in a new sound that's new to some people, but it's fresh. It's still fresh. At the end of the day, it's fresh. And we like fresh stuff, even if it is old. You can get a vintage whatever from 100 years ago, and that motherfucker can still be fresh. So I'm just happy to be, recognized as one of the leaders of the new school. I heard the first two songs, The Blackbird with Tanner Adele, Raina Robertson, Brittany Spencer, and Tierra Kennedy, who Tierra Kennedy is also somebody who I give her flowers because she's been doing it longer than everybody.
You were only waiting for this moment to arise. You were only waiting for this moment.
That was Willie Jones. And now here's my conversation about Cowboy Carter with Larisha Paul. Thanks so much for making time to do this. We're going to talk about Beyoncé and this gigantic, not a country album, a Beyoncé album, as she made clear, but also a gigantic, more than double album, 27 tracks, Cowboy Carter. And there's a lot to talk about. In the broadest sense, the most cliched thing that someone could say about a sort of sprawling, quote-unquote, double album is, oh, it's great, it has so many great tracks, it might be better if it was a little tighter and shorter.
I do think it could be a little bit tighter, but I also don't have moments where I would be willing to throw most of these songs away in order to make that compromise. I think my bigger thing is having to digest the album in parts versus digesting it as a whole top to bottom project. But I think the way that the album is formatted allows for that. When I find myself returning to it, it's in these chunks that she has pretty much sectioned off just on the basis of where the interludes are and where the radio programming is. It's structured in a way that allows for you to revisit it in pieces without it feeling disjointed.
Yeah, almost like sides. It's funny, like I did not grow up in the vinyl era where long albums were naturally divided. It's side 2 of album 2, and that's the way you think of it. So it had this natural sort of apportionment. But you're absolutely right. She definitely did deliberately structure it that way. And even the sound shift. She does an amazing thing on track 21. She has this little sample bit of Chuck Berry. Pretty obscure Chuck Berry song from, I think, 1971 called Oh, Louisiana. And after that, the album gets less sort of rootsy and gets a lot dancier, more R&B.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing about that is the statement that she put out just ahead of the album, where she pretty much said that this record was finished or started and conceptualized before Renaissance was. So I think if we look at it, obviously as an Act 1 and Act 2, with Renaissance being Act 1, Cowboy Carter being Act 2, it feels like you're almost supposed to flip them in a way
Right.
and have Cowboy Carter be the first part, and then that bottom part of the album does bleed pretty seamlessly into Renaissance.
Yes, Two Hands to Heaven could be on Renaissance almost.
Two hands to heaven, my whiskey up high. Oh, God only knows why.
So yeah, it's interesting. And I mean, we should, to take another step back, it is interesting. Obviously, people thought it was a country album, like a full-on country album, to the extent that she had to release a statement saying it's not. But the fact that this had an origin story in her performance with the Chicks at Country Music Awards, and that the crowd was unwelcoming. It was a brilliant performance, but an unwelcoming crowd, and she's been explicit that was the origin story of this album. One thing that's funny is you could absolutely imagine a similar incident being the origin of a Taylor Swift album.
Yeah, I think you could in a different way. They're so different when you really look at their careers. Their relationship with award shows in particular is incredibly different if you think back to when Reputation didn't get nominated for Album of the Year. In the Miss Americana documentary, she was just like, okay, I'm just going to go make a better album. With Beyoncé, it's a very different thing because whether it be the Grammys repeatedly snubbing her for Album of the Year or the CMA Awards giving her such a cold response, all of that is rooted in something that she cannot change, which is her blackness. She can't just go say, I'm going to go make a less black album, because by the nature of her existing as a person, as a black woman, the album is going to have those influences on it pretty plainly in a way that she can't just go and say, okay, I'm going to go change something about me and my artistry to appease an academy of voters in the way that Taylor has and can.
Absolutely. She directly addresses the Album of the Year thing on this album, in fact, in Sweet Honey Bucket.
Fuck it, do it again. AOTY, I ain't win. I ain't stunting about them. Take that shit on the chin. Come back and fuck.
But yeah, she said, come back up and fuck up the pen, but it's not, I'm going to change myself. It's not even about winning. It's just about, I'm going to just keep, she just takes it on the chin and continues on. It is a different attitude.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a testament to the type of artist that Beyoncé is not someone who is actively chasing anything, because she doesn't really have to. I think even the fact that she's able to structure this 3-act project and have all of this music coming out and have it propel her narrative as a musician forward so much this far into her career is a testament to the fact that she's not playing for anyone else. I think she has done all of the pop albums she will ever need to do. Instead of exploring new areas in the way that Beyoncé is, you see a lot of artists who reach that height trying repeatedly to get back to that place. And I think Beyoncé is smart enough to know that the answers that they're looking for are not going to be on a road they've already traveled. She is very much forward focused. Anything else, anything new, anything exciting is going to be in the future. It's going to be far away from what she's already done, even if she just made a trail of crumbs along the way to say, okay, I'm going to come back to that. Obviously, you think about Daddy Lessons, you think about some of the earlier Destiny's Child records that still had this very country, very Houston approach to them. She has placed all of these things so that you can look back and say, okay, maybe that's where the idea to do this sparked. Obviously, people think that Act 3 is going to be a rock album, and so you point to Don't Hurt Yourself and her collaborating with Jack White, and then you think, okay, she's really influenced by Tina Turner. Maybe that next record is going to have all of those influences, and she gives you a roadmap in a way, but she doesn't tell you where she's going, and I think that's the part that makes it really fun and really exciting as a fan to be able to dig in and look at the amount of history that she presents, and that's pretty much all across Cowboy Carter.
I think she also, because of her knowledge of music history and her very broad taste, she's also aware that there's, until maybe recently, it wasn't so uncommon to be able to stride across genres this way. If you look at Prince, a key influence, he didn't do country just because he didn't want to, but he did and there's even a couple things that actually did stray that way a little bit, but he did everything else he wanted to do. Everything and anything else he wanted to do on sometimes all on the same album. And she knows also that there is, and this has been much discussed, that the vast importance of Black artists, Black women in the history of country music specifically. And I love that she nods twice specifically to Chuck Berry, who at the very beginning of rock and roll tied in country and rock as one of the parents of rock and roll. So I think in a way she's also just tapping into a broader way of seeing music that used to be more common.
Yeah, and I think especially with the way that people consume music now, I think it's a rare thing for people to be willing to dive into the history of what they're listening to and what came before that. And I think a lot of people have a one-track mind kind of approach when it comes to the music that they listen to and not really digging into who influenced the artists that they love, even when they can see those artists being deeply influential on another generation. It's the lineage that's being presented throughout this album. And there was a lot of conversation around this album, especially when it was being presented as this kind of country opus and before the This Is a Beyoncé album statement. It was a lot of how is Beyoncé making a country album going to impact country music as a whole? Who is it going to impact? Is it going to shift the industry altogether? And with Beyoncé, you know for a fact that she's already done that in so many ways. Beyoncé is the reason that people think that their music is important enough to release in the middle of the night with no warning. She is the reason that we have New Music Fridays, essentially. And I think part of it was the conversation of reclaiming genres that has surrounded this 3-act project, first starting with the dance music and now country music and then rock music, supposedly. And the reclamation angle was not something that she really started herself in a lot of ways. And I think the thing that's interesting is looking at reclaiming something only through the lens of reclaiming something for a whole group and community of people. I think that's a lot of pressure to put on any one person. All of this is connected to a reclamation also on a personal level of making a statement about who she is and where she comes from, completely detached from country music. But I think the thing that she does do for country, even if it's not shifting the entire industry on its axis, she's putting a spotlight on a lot of young and up-and-coming Black women in country. And so I think when you have someone like Tanner Adele, when you have someone like Brittany Spencer, when you have these young Black women on a song with Beyoncé, a song that was written by Paul McCartney about Black women, I think that there's so much power in that. It's about introducing people to Linda Martell and allowing her to receive her flowers so long after she was essentially blacklisted from country music and not able to thrive in that space anymore because her label at the time decided they were going to divert their resources to a new up-and-coming white female artist, despite how successful she had proven she could be. And so I think it's all part of a larger narrative that extends so far beyond the boundaries of this is how Beyoncé is going to change country music.
Yeah, I was not surprised when it turned out to not be a start-to-finish country album. Again, I was just thinking about it in this broader sense that it used to be not that uncommon for people to do lots of different things and to do lots of different things on one album. And that when Tina Turner did Up City Limits, like now we would say, Tina Turner just made a country song. What's going on? At the time, it was just, here's another Tina Turner song. It's kind of country. Don't worry so much about it. I think that people have gotten more rigid about genres, weirdly. I think it's a major achievement. Where do you rank it? She says it's her best music ever. Where do you rank it?
To already be shifting the ranking around, I don't think I've sat with the album long enough to do that. But I will say that her vocal performances on this album, I don't think she's ever sounded better. She continues to make these giant shifts in her artistry this many decades into her career is, I think, the most stellar achievement about this record. I think it's the thing that stands out to me more than anything else. She doesn't have an album where she sounds this great while traversing through so many different sounds, so many different genres, where she's singing in Italian on this album for fun because she can. She's rapping on this album because she does that too. And she's shown us that she can do all of these incredible things with her voice, but there's some really gymnastics level vocal performances going on across this record. And I think on that alone, I think it places this in her top 2 albums, at least. Maybe 3.
Wow, okay. You started out not wanting to rank it, and now it's hit the top 2. So even in...
I really started thinking about her voice, and I was just like, man.
Absolutely. Tell me about your reaction to the opening track, American Requiem.
While I sing my song, can you hear me?
It made so much sense when I found out who her collaborators were on that. When I heard it, I think at least subliminally, I definitely was thinking about Jon Batiste. And it is funny to get Jon Batiste, who Grammys love possibly as much as anyone. That is a funny Grammy subtweet. To bring in Jon Batiste. It also has this interesting sort of almost like prog rock vibe to it. It's an interesting song. What do you make of it?
I think it's an incredible way to open the album. And I think especially when you get to the end with Amen and then it wraps wraps so seamlessly back around and feels like one very long song. I think the inflections in her voice and the way that she's singing things, this Louisiana dialect that she's delivering some of these lyrics with, I think it really does set the stage for the thesis of this album, regardless of where she goes sonically across the rest of it. I think as an opening statement, it is, when you see a lot of people saying she's framing it around award show, this experience she had in an award show, and she's talking about the Grammys, and I think a lot about the speech that Jay-Z gave at the Grammys this year, where he went up there and was just like, Beyonce will not get up here herself and tell you all how insane it is that she is the most awarded artist in the history of this award show and not once have won album of the year. It doesn't make any sense, because it's true. She's so gracious as she sits there and watches other people win awards that a lot of other people believe that she deserved. But anyway, American Requiem, I think, is really a statement piece. And I think opening an album with that gave her the freedom to delve into all the other things that she gets into across this album. But I think having that artistic element at the very beginning, where her vocals sound so ethereal and so grandiose, while saying, I'm going to get this off my chest now, and then we're going to more or less move on, I think is really important to do.
Yeah, and I think she's talking about a few broader things on that song that are actually really interesting. Goodbye to what has been a pretty house that we never settled in. If you think about her talking about if the we is Black America, is pretty interesting.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think when you, even the verse right before that, and she's talking about, she's naming Louisiana and Alabama and all of these different places where Black culture is the root of the community there and the foundation of a lot of creative scenes, a lot of social and civil scenes and things like that. It all ties in to create this larger thing of, this is not entirely about me.
That's absolutely right. And when she says in the bridge, when she says it's a lot of talking going on while I sing my song, and then, it's basically, do you hear me? People took it as there's a lot of talking about her, but she says there's a lot of talking while. So the image is of someone on stage and people are talking over her. And it's a statement of like, are you really listening to what I'm saying? A good way to start a big statement album. And the album's second track is Beyonce's incredible cover of Blackbird, the Beatles song that was really a Paul McCartney solo performance and composition. Paul's been explicit about the fact that he was writing about a Black woman and that it was very much his civil rights song at the time. I definitely recommend that everyone check out Rob Sheffield's brilliant essay in Rolling Stone about Beyonce's cover, which he calls the best version of Blackbird ever. And Beyonce's cover is incredibly faithful to the Beatles recording. In fact, Paul McCartney is credited as producer and credited for playing guitar and for his foot tapping on the track. But that's because she used his original guitar track and foot tapping from the recording that was on the White Album. But in his essay, Rob links this very faithful version to the wildest Blackbird cover ever, which was Sylvester's disco version from 1979. And he links that back to Renaissance and to Beyonce's Uncle Johnny, who she dedicated that album to. Anyway, I definitely recommend reading Rob's essay. I thought Protector is just a beautiful song about being a mom.
I will be your projector. An apricot picked right up.
It's actually a relatively small subgroup of songs, of great, beautiful mom songs, and it's definitely instantly high in that small pantheon of songs.
In my mind, Protector and Two Most Wanted are very connected to me.
Say goodbye to the old me. Came out of nowhere, didn't give no warning. Pedal so heavy like a Two Most Wanted.
I think just in the narrative of singing about showing up for people, whether it be your kids, Two Most Wanted, which is the Miley Cyrus collaboration, yes, has such a strong thread about female friendship and showing up for people who are chosen family or whatever the case may be, and just really being there for people. And they're so far apart on the record, but they really do function in a similar way. And I think Beyonce's motherhood has been one of the greatest influences on how we've seen her music transform over the last decade.
Two Most Wanted, I had never thought about a Beyonce Miley Cyrus duet, but it works really beautifully. And I love the fact that although she had the version of this album finished, I guess, years ago, she was still changing things. And one of the things she's changed is that she saw that incredible Grammy performance by Miley Cyrus and said, I'm getting Miley. Didn't know she was auditioning for the Beyonce album, but she was. The singles, Texas Hold'em, just such an undeniable song and such a huge hit.
If I can't slow dance with you, come pour some sugar on me, honey, too. It's a real live boogie. Boogie in a real live hold down. Don't be a bitch, come take it to the floor now.
I do think she sings about it on 16 Carriages. She sings about it on American Requiem. Someone had a very funny line, which is that she sings about her father like he's dead.
Oh my God.
Let me put it this way. She doesn't pull any punches singing about her dad. Whether the line on the song Daughter about how she's just like her dad. She can be very cold if you cry. So it's just, she doesn't, and she hasn't for a while. She hasn't hidden her feelings about her dad on record. And some people say like Beyonce withholds herself and that we don't really know her as a person. I think that's so wrong. She's actually incredibly confessional and has been for a long time.
Yeah, I think she's just very upfront. And I think sometimes people end up looking for deeper meanings in things that are very on the surface. And so while they're looking deeper, they're missing a very obvious surface level truth, looking for all of these extra explanations of things. I think even on 16 Carriages,
driving away while I watch them ride with my dreams away to the summer sunset.
it was such a beautiful introduction to the album in a way that I think Texas Hold'em was a lot of fun. 16 Carriages was a song that really made me excited for what this project might sound like. But even that, a lot of people were being like, oh, this doesn't have to be autobiographical. There is a lot of storytelling going on across this album, but there are also parts of her truth that are in this. And her collaborators have spoken a lot about how even if there are writing sessions and there's a song that's brought to her, by the time she's done with it, it is not the original song that was just handed to her. You can't really give Beyonce a song and just say, sing this way, and she's going to do that. She shows us that across this album. If you think about the way that she flips Jolene and the conversation around that of being like, a lot of people don't think that her version of Jolene, because it's so far from the approach to Jolene that Dolly Parton took, but it's also, if you're Beyonce, your reaction to a figure like Jolene is not going to be the same as Dolly Parton's, is not going to be the same. Somebody joked and it was just like, we need a song from Jolene's perspective, and someone was like, that's Ariana Grande's Eternal Sunshine.
I want to talk more about Jolene in a second, but I really love the song. I've seen a bunch of people react to the song Bodyguard. Just a great little pop rock song.
I whisper secrets in the backbeat. You make me cry, you make me happy, happy.
She is doing a very particular vibe vocal-wise on that song. It shows how much she can embody sort of a character and sing very differently. She sings very differently on that song. I think it's a special song. I don't know what you think.
Absolutely. I was out this weekend and my friend and I bullied the bartender at the place that we were at into playing Bodyguard. There was a table of 4 or 5 black girls sitting in the corner of this cocktail bar, and the vibe in the room, the way that everything felt so together and communal and excited when that song started, I was like, this is a hit. I don't know if it's a hidden hit. I don't know how she's going to. I think I saw a lot of people comparing it to the way that people responded to Cuff It.
Black lights, spaceships fly. Unapologetic when we fuck up the night.
Cuff It had a really strong fan base when the album came out, and I think Bodyguard kind of functions in that same way, where in the context of the album, it doesn't really sound like anything else.
Prince had a thing for Sheryl Crow, as all right-thinking people do. He loves Sheryl Crow, and he used to cover her sometimes, and the vibe actually specifically reminds me of Prince covering Sheryl Crow. And the other thing is, as far as how it fits in, the other thing she said as far as a manifesto for this album, this is all in a press release, because that's the best we get. Beyonce, we'd love you to do an interview, but the best we get is a press release. And she said that she wanted, on top of everything else, she was very focused on organic instrumentation, and that she was thinking about AI and technology and flying in the face of that. And I think it's a song that sounds like it was played by a band. And so if it fits in, and pretty acoustic guitar heavy, so if it fits in, I think it fits in on that basis. And also just, she was just like, this is a great song, I'm putting it on. But Jolene, as you said, controversial. I think it's a song that it's a very covered song. So is Blackbird, but Jolene, I don't know, for whatever reason, I've heard more versions of Jolene from every possible angle. So even as a straight coverer, I'm not going to necessarily be excited about literally anyone's version. I think it's interesting that she changed it. People were being hard on it on Twitter, on X over the weekend.
Yeah, I think what it reminded me of, interestingly, was when Olivia Rodrigo put out Driver's License, and then there was like the whole drama about Sabrina Carpenter and people writing songs from the perspective of the quote-unquote blonde girl. And then when Sabrina actually started putting out music that seemed to be a response to Driver's License and the drama flurry around it, people were annoyed that she she wasn't writing the songs that they predicted her to write, because she was writing from her own experience of her reality of how she would actually react to the things that were happening in her life. And when I was thinking about it through that lens, it was like, I think it's fun to see different plays on these characters, right? You think about people, you send 5 actresses in to read for a role, they might not all perform that role in the same way. They're going to all bring a different attitude, a different approach. And I think especially in the context of an album like Lemonade, informed by a narrative of infidelity and all of these things, that it's just like, of course she would perform Jolene in this way. I would not expect Beyoncé to get on a song and say, this white woman is so much more beautiful than me. Oh my God, what am I going to do? I don't think that's true to Beyoncé as a performer. I think a straightforward cover would have been really boring, honestly. I think she had to do something else. I think the Dolly P introduction is so cute and so fun. And so I don't know, maybe people are not listening to it top to bottom, but I do think that little interlude and that introduction from Dolly Parton herself is almost like a cosign of allowing Beyoncé to take this story somewhere else. I think all straightforward covers, or they feel unnecessary a lot of time, because like you're saying, you could just go listen to the original version. There's so many versions. And it's just at that rate, you could just go back and listen to Dolly's version if that's what you want to hear and that's the narrative you want to hear. But I think Beyoncé actually playing around, and the film influences on this album, I think feed into that as well, because you can toy around with characters. And I think we're in a state of media literacy, or a lack of media literacy, where people need characters to be very straightforward and uncomplicated so that they can understand them. And I think when a lot of times, especially with female characters, if they're not pristine and they have baggage and they're messy and they don't do things the way that an audience wants them to, they're often written off as unlikable. And they're just, it's not that they're unlikable, it's that they're complex. And I think adding this layer to it was actually a lot of fun. That's the way that I was reading it. I don't understand what everyone's so mad about when these are not people. It's fine. I'm sure Jolene pissed someone off years and years ago and is never going to live that down, and that's on her. But I think this is like a fun way to toy with something that's a classic while bringing something new to it the whole time.
So I think a few people have pointed out that the next track, Daughter, could be very easily seen as a continuation of Beyoncé's version of the Jolene story.
Let me right in. She was a big fan.
Basically, she delivers a beatdown to someone who very much could be Jolene. And it's a really interesting song because it goes back to, once again, truly seems to refer to her actual dad, Matthew Knowles. And it's called Daughter, even though that word never appears in the song, because it's about her finding this sort of, I don't know, dark side, cold side within her that's as cold as Titanic water, as she puts it, meaning the water surrounding the Titanic. I would assume not like the water you drink inside the Titanic. We get it. It's poetry, Beyoncé. We get it. She's literally saying she's not a saint. Don't mess with her. And if you do mess with her, you'll see that she is her father's daughter. And she says that it's interesting. There's perhaps a hint of dark pride in it, but also regret. I think that there's some real complexity there.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think people pointed out that this song kind of fits into the category of Beyoncé songs alongside 6 Inch from Lemonade or Haunted from Self-Titled. These songs that have these really kind of ominous feelings to them, even All Up in Your Mind from Renaissance, that just have this kind of weight to them that takes you and transports you somewhere else just on the basis of sound alone, to really set the scene for what it is that she's singing and the characters that she's portraying in these songs. And I think with this album in particular, the references that she drew from different films, whether that be Martin Scorsese or Quentin Tarantino, whatever the case may be, it adds to that kind of cinematic illusion of using sound to transport you somewhere else within a story.
It did just occur to me that it's sort of funny that Beyoncé picked certain people who sometimes get punched around on Twitter, Martin Scorsese, Quentin Tarantino, the Beatles, and she's like, actually, I like all of them, which is actually pretty funny.
Yeah, no Martin slander over here.
Yeah, we'll skip to Levi's Jeans, which is fun to talk about.
Boy, I let you be my Levi jeans, so you can hug that ass all day long.
I like and appreciate Post Malone. I think this song is like It's super fun. It's super cheesy. It's not my favorite track. The chorus is a little generic to me. I know you like it.
I think it's cute. And I think if we meet Post Malone where he's at on this record, it's a lot of fun. I do enjoy him in a more melodic space. I think he has a really great instinct for pop melody. I think if he would have shown up anywhere else on this album that had heavier R&B influences or heavier hip-hop influences, it would have sounded a lot more out of place. I know a lot of people were confused about why he's on this album at all. It's fun. I think it's also a thing of the way that some of the lyrics are delivered are a lot of fun. I think especially the very end where you have Post Malone in the outro and he's going, "Need you all night long, you're my renaissance," and having that little callback. And he genuinely, his voice sounds really great on this record in particular.
His heart is clearly in a rootsier space. It's a really weird thing. Post Malone is actually now recording a country album, so she probably was aware of that. This is where he's moving himself. I think that the hip-hop influences that he started out early on with we could talk for a long time about Post Malone and hip-hop and what that was all about, but I'm not sure it was that close to his heart, frankly. And of course, it's the fact that he can abandon it as easily as that is part of the whole complication. He loves roots stuff, and for all we know, I think he's making at least one country album, but if that clicks, I wouldn't be surprised to see him in that rootsier world going forward, because it's just like, all you have to do is hear him talk about his favorites, and you know where he really belongs. So at least he's not trying to rap anymore, right?
Yeah. I think it's just one of those things where you look, even like someone like Machine Gun Kelly, you look at these kind of broader, and we don't have to get too deep into it, but it is really just a thing of benefiting from hip-hop culture, but keeping it at a distance so that when it's time to jump ship and do something else to preserve career or an image or whatever the case may be, it's really easy to do that. But I don't think that Post Malone was necessarily faking when he was making hip-hop music. I think he genuinely did want to be making that at the time. I just don't think it made total sense for him to. I think especially once we started seeing these stronger pop sensibilities come out, it was just, why weren't you doing this the whole time?
So you got to talk about this amazing, incredibly fun song and deceptively deep song, and just a kind of an instant classic, and not to mention in its own way a Tina Turner tribute to the song "Yeah Yeah."
Yeah, I think it's really incredible to have a song this far down on the track list being an introduction already. You're 20 songs in, and she's, saying, "We want to welcome you to Beyoncé Cowboy Carter Act 2. And then we have the reference to the rodeo chitlin circuit and all of these things where she's really pulling in these historical references. And the song that precedes this is the Linda Martell Show. And so we have a historical element there of her putting a spotlight on someone who was influential and important and pivotal for Black country artists and Black women in country music specifically. And having her be really a centerpiece of this transformative element of the album. Because I think from this area forward, and I think some people are marking it a little further down around Riverdance, but I think really with the Linda Martell Show, track 19 through the vinyl track 27, it takes the album into a whole different world from that point forward.
Absolutely. The truth is, people are talking about a Beyoncé rock album. This definitely falls into the category of a rock song, among many other things. There's an amazing sort of like driving guitar thing that propels it along with horns. And yeah, it could be an amazing Tina Turner song. It sounds like it could be from a long time ago, but it also sounds like it's right now. It's really exciting to me. It's a really exciting song.
Yeah, and I think it's also a really good thing to point out, and I think especially as people are receiving their vinyl records for the album, you'll notice that the band on the record spells out Beyoncé, which is the original family spelling of Beyonce's name. And there's like a lot of history there about that her mother has explained about how the name transformed within their family over the years, but even that has like an element of reclamation to it. And so when you look at the intentionality of her in the chorus here, just spelling that name out and then talking about my family lived and died in America, and just having this whole American Southern history lesson packed into this song that is just so much fun and feels like a grand event in and of itself.
And then again, the heavier themes that are embedded in this album and are probably most explicit on the first and last track, but come up a lot here in this incredibly fun driving song. She sings "Whole Lot of Red" in that white and blue. History can't be erased. She, again, is making things pretty clear throughout. And then Beach Boys, Good Vibrations nod, which means that this incredibly driving soul rock song has songwriting credits to the Beach Boys. in it, which another thing that I could not have predicted, that there would be a Brian Wilson credit on this Beyoncé album.
And even referencing Gary, Indiana, and having that Michael Jackson reference in there in a very subtle way, and the Sonics being such a tribute to Tina Turner, and just all of these different artists that don't overwhelm. The references aren't so strong that you're distracted by them. They're just really fun Easter eggs that she has sprinkled throughout the whole record, but particularly on this song.
I'll take it as a nod to the entire Jackson family, even Tito, everybody. I think it's...
Oh boy. Yeah, okay.
Jermaine, everybody's in there, especially Janet. I just wanted to mention Oh Louisiana, the little interlude, mostly because it's the second Chuck Berry bit on this album. And as I already mentioned, Chuck Berry was so important in his very first hit, Maybelline, which was extremely important in the history of rock and roll. It was a black man doing really revved up country music. And that was his angle into rock and roll. I think people don't necessarily understand Chuck's place in that sort of country narrative as well. And how much the lines were, what Beyoncé understands, and I keep saying this, is how much these lines didn't really exist. That country and rock and roll were once almost the same thing. And Elvis and Chuck Berry were among the people playing with that line. That's what rockabilly was and what Chuck Berry helped invent. You hear a little bit of Maybelline itself in the Willie Nelson track when you're flipping through the radio. So you hear a little bit of Maybelline. And then in this track, Oh Louisiana, it's actually, again, a sign that Beyoncé and her team dig extremely deep. It's actually a pretty damn obscure Chuck Berry song, sped up in an old Kanye style, soul sample sped up of a really deep cuts. Much, much respect for that, honestly. So Riverdance, I'm warming up to it.
On that shit, dance, bounce on that shit, dance, bounce on that shit, no hands. Staring down the barrel of my gun, yes,
I would characterize it as perhaps a fun throwaway, but I was saying some of my favorite Beyoncé songs, some people might say they're throwaways. Like one of my absolute favorite Beyoncé songs is 7-Eleven, which definitely does not have a deep message. It's almost like refreshing given all the thematic and musical weight of her music of the past decade as she becomes more and more overtly serious as an artist.
Yeah, and I think it just reminds me of like little cuts like Kitty Cat on B-Day, where you have these moments that kind of see her taking on a little bit of a character and just playing around and just having this really light and fun performance, which in contrast to a lot of the heavier moments, I think so much of Cowboy Carter on its own is a history lesson. And so it is important to have these fun moments sprinkled in because people don't want to feel like you're preaching to them or you're slamming a book over their head and forcing them to learn something. It's a very complicated history as well when we're talking about Southern culture, we're talking about Black culture, you're talking about the erasure of Black artistry. So when I look at these songs that extend the track list a little bit and they're a bit long, even to have songs that are running 4 and 5 minutes, she could have made a 27-track album where everything hovered around 2.5 minutes, you know what I mean? But she did take the time to allow the music to breathe and have this space. And if that means we get a little bit of a fun, bouncy song, I think that's worth having the track list be this long and have it breaking up these heavier moments throughout the record.
And Tyrant is really fun, in part because it has a total fake out intro, another bit from Dolly Parton, and then a kind of country sounding thing.
your hands are steady and you sleep at night. How did you turn your heart to stone?
But then 40 seconds in, the real song starts and it's totally different, deep into R&B.
I think that was the most fun part of listening to this album for the first time, is just really not knowing what was going to happen next at any point in time. Just all of these different things where, you know, I saw a lot of people who are really stressed out about how they're going to learn all of these songs for the tour. Now, all of these songs are not making the tour set list. We know that for a fact because a lot of the Renaissance songs did not make the set list for that tour. And so how all of these things are going to be blended together, I don't think we need to be studying every single song on here, but I do think that it's a fun thing for people to want to sit and learn every single lyric, learn every single beat switch and know when everything is coming. And I think even if we think back to even Yaya, there are certain moments on that song where you're not expecting a certain line or a certain lyric to come in at the time that it does. Her timing is really interesting on these songs and it really keeps you on your toes in a lot of ways.
The second to last track, Sweet Honey Buckin', which of course is 3 separate songs, Sweet Honey and Buckin'. And it's a great way to bring us towards the end in the great tradition of massive of concept album closings. It's like a little mini Abbey Road medley, except with Pharrell.
And I love seeing Shaboozey again on the record. I think Honey it's so Beyonce. And I think especially when we're thinking about this side of the record bleeding into Renaissance a bit more, you think about Pure Honey and how those two things are in conversation with one another. But I think even Buckin' is one of the silliest songs I've ever heard within a song. Hearing it for the first time and knowing that this "Look at That Horse" chant is just going to become like a staple within social conversation. It's just so funny to be like, look at that horse. And it's stupid, but it's so much fun. And so you see Beyonce and Pharrell, who have not collaborated in quite a long time. And so you're seeing them have all of this back and forth, but then also within that, you get the Grammys reference about her Album of the Year snubs. And so it's always this balance of, yeah, I'm having a good time and I'm being playful and I'm being silly, but also let me remind you really quickly how we arrived here and who I am.
I'd love to know the backstory of how this became this sort of medley. Did she work with Pharrell and they had all these bits, and instead of finishing them, it would be way more fun to jam them together? I would presume it's something like that, but someday we'll find out, maybe. From Pharrell, not from Beyonce.
From Pharrell himself, yes.
Yeah, we'll never find out. We'll never find out from Beyonce, but when she decides to do one big interview in 10 years and it has to last 10 hours because there's so many albums to talk about. So when you mention the tour, we don't know that there's a tour, right?
I don't think we know explicitly that there's a tour, but The Dream, who produced a couple of songs across the record, has been teasing a tour. I would imagine her not bringing this album on the road. A lot of this record feels geared towards experiencing it live in a similar way that Renaissance, but I think she's singing across the album, especially 16 Carriages, about the strain that being on tour puts on her and being away from her kids or not being in as stable of a home situation when she's on the road. And she was injured at the very beginning of the last tour. And so it just ends up being this part of the narrative of the album, essentially.
Yeah. And then fundamentally, this album, she's spoken about and we spoke about how quote unquote organic it is. That's her word. And which means that it's tremendously driven by live instruments. You can imagine it being particularly exciting live because it's built for that. I wanted to talk about the final track, Amen.
And it crumbled, yes, it crumbled. The statues they made will be you.
Which is so beautiful, has such incredible gospel harmonies, and deliberately goes full circle with the opening track, American Requiem. Certainly starting with Lemonade, but some people would argue starting with self-titled. Beyonce has been fully in the world of what we would call concept albums, which are more than a set of songs. They have an overarching concept and sometimes story and idea. And one of the old signatures of a concept album going back to the 60s, or you could look at something like another classic example would be What's Going On by Marvin Gaye, is the opening and closing track that speaks to each other. That's how you know it's a concept album. It wraps itself around. And this is an absolute textbook example of this. Amen is very much in conversation with American Requiem, both musically and lyrically. And she's returning to some very heavy subject matter. This house was built with blood and bone, of course, talking about America, presumably, and it crumbled. The statues they made were beautiful, but they were lies of stone. And she says, tell me, can you hear me now? Yes, see, I think we can hear you. You could read it as a domestic narrative as well. There may be an element of that. Sometimes you can be telling two stories at once. But then the ending is really interesting because she flips a lyric from American Requiem. In American Requiem, she says, I'll be the one to purify my father's sins, which feels, again, like another little Matthew Knowles reference. Tough album for Matthew Knowles. Another in a series of tough albums for Matthew Knowles. But it'd be funny if other artists just start taking jabs at Matthew Knowles, just see how much he can take. But this flips it in a much bigger way. And it says, say a prayer for what has been, we'll be the ones to purify our father's sins. American Requiem, them old ideas are buried here. It really, again, becomes much bigger, and you see where she's going with it. And reading it doesn't really give the power of how it's delivered with all the harmonies. It's just a overwhelmingly powerful song, and as incredible, actually, an album conclusion as I can remember.
Yeah, I agree. And I think especially for an album of this length and an album that delves so much into history and goes on so many journeys within an hour and 18 minutes, essentially, it's a really important thing to have a song like this to close it out and really bring it back home. And it doesn't even feel disjointed as Sweet Honey Buckin transitions into it. And they're two totally different songs. They couldn't be further from each other, but it doesn't feel like there's so much happening that you're being thrown somewhere else and you don't know what's happening. It all feels like it fits, everything fits into this puzzle where it's supposed to, and it brings you right back to the top of the album again. I think especially after you spent over an hour sitting with the record, you might have songs you want to immediately go back to or that you're drawn to, and I think if this album were to have ended on the note of Sweet Honey Buckin', it would have felt a little disjointed, a little bit like that very first song. By the time that we get to the end of this record, if it were to close with Sweet Honey Buckin', it would have felt like she was just done with whatever it was that she had said an hour and 15 minutes before. And so having Amen close it out really does make it feel like a cohesive and singular project. And I think something like that for Beyoncé at this point in her career, with this 3-act trilogy, the fact that not one music video has been released for anything feels really telling to me, in her wanting people to pay more attention to the vocal delivery on these songs, pay more attention to the lyrics on this song and the narrative of what's being said across both Cowboy Carter especially, but also Renaissance. I think it's so different, and I think it's another way that she's subverting our expectations, because I think everyone thought, okay, the album's going to come out and then she's going to drop all the videos and we're going to have that to sift through and dissect. I do think this is an album that we're going to be talking about for a long time. I think there are constantly going to be new things to dissect and to pull in. Even last night at the iHeartRadio Awards, she received an Innovator Award from Stevie Wonder and thanked him for playing harmonica on Jolene. No one knew he played harmonica on Jolene. And so there's all of these other things. She thanks Sister Rosetta Tharpe. And so that's fueling the Act 3 might be a rock album theories. She really studied the history of American music to create this project and still have it be in the vein of I'm Beyoncé and this is how I made this record. And so I think in that sense, it's a really exciting thing to see an artist want to do the work, but not want to do the work for you necessarily. And so to still leave it open to be a learning opportunity for listeners, I think that's really one of the most successful things about Cowboy Carter as a whole project.
What is the actual evidence that the next album is a rock album?
I don't know that there's so much of it. I think it was really rooted in, or the theories around it were more so rooted in people believing that she was reclaiming genres across this. The idea of this 3-act trilogy being a reclamation of Black genres that have been whitewashed or that have been overlooked, and people within, pioneers within those genres that have been overlooked. Beginning with dance music and then moving into country, it just seemed like rock was the next logical genre to move into that space with. But I think we can talk about the fact that reclaiming something could be, she could be reclaiming these genres on a personal level. There was a personal element to her exploring dance music, and that was her Uncle Johnny, and that was such a large part of that. If you listen to this record, a lot of this is about Beyoncé as a Black woman from the South. That is a personal reclamation from my perspective that really is not created in the sense of I'm going to be a savior for country music. And I think it would also discredit the Black artists that have been doing so much incredible work and creating so much incredible music within country to say, okay, Beyoncé is going to come save the genre. I don't think that's what she was intending on doing. And Beyoncé usually tells us so little about her plans and really does want you to do the work on your own that you end up believing that she is trying to communicate something that she has never explicitly said herself that she was trying to communicate. And so I think the theories about Act 3 being a rock album are a lot of fun. There's been some imagery of Beyoncé on motorcycles, of Beyoncé in these leather jackets, and like all of these things that you can piece together the Easter eggs if you look for them and say, okay, this seems to be what she's pointing to. And obviously Tina Turner being such a massive influence on Beyoncé. Generally, you hear it a lot across Cowboy Carter, but Tina Turner was the queen of rock and roll. So why would she not want to continue to pay homage and continue to explore that in different ways? I think there's so many different approaches that Beyoncé could take to rock music. I think Beyoncé is, in a way, become a genre in and of itself. I think she is just her own space of music. So I think when we think about, oh, Act 3 is going to be a rock album, I think that's a catch-all for Beyoncé is going to get on this record and probably do whatever it is she wants. But then you think about Cowboy Carter being placed as a continuation of Daddy Lessons, which is considered her first country song, and having that on Lemonade, but also having Don't Hurt Yourself on Lemonade with Jack White, and believing she could want to explore that a little bit more. When you look across her discography, there are always little moments where you're just like, I could see her coming back and revisiting this in a different way later on, because it seems to be that she dips in and out of different areas of her discography, and you can draw threads between the then and the now, but she's so advanced and so far away from those moments as an artist that they can sound like two completely different things, but it feels like the foundational layers are pretty much always there.
But anyway, thanks so much for going through this very long album with me.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
I think, as you were saying, people are trying to digest it very fast, but they need to give themselves time because she's making music in a way that people used to make music when it wasn't supposed to be a 3-day digestion period and then you move on to the next album. She's making music for the ages. And that's our show. We'll be back next week. In the meantime, subscribe to Rolling Stone Music Now, wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us 5 stars and a nice review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, because that's always appreciated. But as always, thanks so much for listening, and we will see you next week.